There was $61,000 sitting in my education account, money my late grandmother specifically set aside for my medical degree. But in front of 20 family members at my brother's housewarming party, my dad slammed a bank closure notice down on the kitchen island. He smirked and said, "It's gone. We transferred it to fund your brother's new home. You were never finishing nursing school anyway." Everyone chuckled, expecting me to cry. I didn't. I calmly picked up the paper, handed it back, and asked him to keep it safe for me. Then, I grabbed my keys, walked out, and drove straight to the central bank downtown before the 5 p.m. closing bell. 10 minutes later, my phone exploded, and my mom was pounding on my car window in the bank parking lot, shoeless, hysterical, and screaming that I'd ruined everything. But she was too late. The visitor log had already told a very different story. My name is Clara Sterling. I'm 27 years old, and if you ask my parents, they tell you I'm the biggest disappointment in the Sterling bloodline. According to my father, I was the girl who started a dozen hobbies, signed up for endless classes, and never had the discipline to finish a single thing. For years, I let them believe that narrative. It was easier than explaining the truth. The afternoon of my brother Julian's housewarming party was supposed to be a celebration. Julian was 24, the golden boy of the family, and he had just purchased a gorgeous, sprawling 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. More than 20 relatives were packed into his gleaming, quartz countertop kitchen, clinking champagne glasses and showering him with praise. I was standing near the edge of the island, quietly sipping my water, when my father, Richard, cleared his throat loudly. The room fell silent. Everyone turned, expecting Dad to give another glowing toast about his successful son. Instead, he looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, carrying that familiar, patronizing sneer I'd grown up with. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out an official document, and slammed it face up on the kitchen counter right in front of my drink. "Take a good look at that, Clara," Dad announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings so every single aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear. It was a bank closure notice for my educational trust account, an account my late grandmother had established for me years ago, sitting at exactly $61,000. It was supposed to cover my final tuition fees and clinical licensing expenses for my medical degree. "It's gone," Dad said, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his lips. "We officially transferred the entire balance this morning to cover the remaining down payment and renovation costs for Julian's new home. After all, let's be honest with ourselves, you were never finishing nursing school anyway. Why let $61,000 rot in an account for a degree you're just going to drop out of?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. My mother, standing beside him, nodded in agreement, crossing her arms as if a grand justice had just been served. Julian didn't even look guilty. He just smirked and took a sip of his wine. They expected me to break down. They expected me to burst into tears, scream, and prove to everyone once again that I was emotional and unstable. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I slowly leaned down, picked up the paper, and looked at the timestamp stamped on the top right corner. Then, I set it back down, met my father's eyes, and smiled softly. "Thanks for letting me know, Dad," I said quietly. "Make sure you keep that original notice safe in your wallet. You're definitely going to need it." Before anyone could ask what I meant, I grabbed my purse, turned on my heel, and walked out into the driveway. The engine of my sedan roared to life, and I backed out of Julian's driveway before my brain even had time to process the adrenaline surging through my veins. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 4:22 p.m. The central downtown branch of First National Bank closed its doors at exactly 5 p.m., giving me less than 40 minutes to cross town in afternoon traffic. My parents thought they were so clever. They assumed that because my name was listed alongside my father's on that educational account, it was a simple joint fund he could drain at will. What they didn't realize was that when my grandmother established that trust, she made sure it wasn't a standard bank account. It was an irrevocable educational trust, bound by very specific legal covenants tied directly to my clinical graduation requirements. Dad had managed to initiate a temporary transfer by signing a fraudulent hardship waiver, claiming I had abandoned my studies. But grandmother's terms had an ironclad built-in safeguard. Any unauthorized liquidation by a co-trustee triggered an automatic 48-hour freeze, unless the primary beneficiary verified the withdrawal in person. I pulled into the bank's executive parking lot at 4:48 p.m., my tires squealing slightly against the pavement. I was stepping out of the car when I heard a screech of brakes behind me. My mother's SUV had pulled up diagonally across 2 parking spaces, blocking the drive lane. The driver's side door flew open, and my mother scrambled out, breathless and disheveled. She had driven so frantically after me that she hadn't even put on her shoes. Her stocking-clad feet slapped against the hot asphalt as she sprinted toward me. "Clara, stop right there," she screamed, her voice cracking as she pounded her fists against my driver's side window before I could fully shut the door. "Don't you dare do this. You are going to ruin your brother's future. He already signed the purchase agreement." I turned to look at her, completely unfazed by her hysterical outburst. Her face was flushed red, her hair pulled wild from the wind, standing shoeless in a public parking lot while bank security guards watched from a glass entrance. "I'm not ruining his future, Mom," I said calmly, stepping around her and straightening my coat. "I'm just going inside to make sure mine isn't stolen." Walking past the security guards and into the quiet air conditioning of the bank lobby, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 5 years. Out in the parking lot, my mother was still frantically trying to explain her barefoot existence to the bank security team. Inside, I was finally safe from their noise. My parents had spent nearly a decade building the narrative that I was a failure. To them, I was the girl who couldn't stick to anything. They loved telling relatives about how I'd enrolled in a pre-med program at 19, only to drop out after 2 semesters. They loved bringing up how I started a physical therapy course at 21, only to walk away from that, too. "Clara just lacks grit," my father would say at holiday dinners, shaking his head with manufactured pity. "She gets overwhelmed the second things get tough." What my father conveniently forgot to mention was why I walked away from those programs. When I was 19, Julian got caught up with a bad crowd and racked up $15,000 in illegal gambling debts to people who didn't take IOUs. My parents came to me in tears, begging me to help save my brother's life and protect the family name. I dropped out, took 2 service jobs, and handed over every paycheck to clear his debt. 2 years later, when I tried to go back to school, Julian crashed my father's uninsured truck into a luxury sedan. Once again, my parents pleaded poverty. Once again, I sacrificed my tuition money and stepped away from my classes to work graveyard shifts to keep Julian out of a courtroom. They mistook my silence for submission. They assumed that because I never threw their enabling behavior back in their faces, I was too weak to notice what they were doing. So, when I secretly enrolled in nursing school at 24, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't tell them a single thing. I paid my own initial fees, worked overnight shifts as a hospital unit clerk, and let them go on believing I was just working a dead-end retail job. I let them call me a quitter, a flake, and a disappointment. I swallowed my pride every single day because I knew that if they realized how close I was to earning my degree, they would find a way to bleed me dry one last time. And today, they had finally tried. The bank manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Vance, ushered me into her private glass office. She brought up the account ledger on her computer monitor, her brow furrowing deeply as her eyes scanned the recent transaction history. "Your father came into our suburban branch yesterday," Ms. Vance explained, turning the screen slightly toward me. "He brought a signed affidavit claiming that you were no longer enrolled in any accredited medical or nursing program, that you'd abandoned your clinicals months ago, and that the trust conditions were officially broken due to inactivity." I couldn't help but let out a bitter, quiet laugh. "He actually put that in writing?" "He did," she confirmed, pulling up a scanned PDF of the document. "Under penalty of perjury, he swore that you hadn't attended a single class or clinical rotation since last November." Without saying a word, I opened my leather satchel and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. Inside was my official transcript, a certified letter signed by the Dean of Nursing, and a stamped copy of my state board examination registration. But the real nail in his coffin was the second item I laid out on her desk, an official, certified log extract from St. Jude Children's Hospital. Because I was completing advanced pediatric clinicals in a secure unit, every single student was required to sign the electronic security visitor log upon entering and exiting the building. My log showed over 800 hours of meticulously documented clinical service over the past 6 months alone. Ms. Vance flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to utter shock. But then, as her eyes hit the bottom of the second page, she froze. "Ms. Sterling, look at this timestamp from 3 weeks ago," she said, her finger tracing a highlighted line on the hospital's security log. I leaned forward. There, recorded in black and white on the hospital's security system, was an entry from July 14th at 2:15 p.m. A visitor had checked into the administration wing, attempting to access my academic record by claiming to be my personal financial sponsor. The name on the visitor log wasn't mine. It was Richard Sterling. My father hadn't just made an assumption that I was failing. He had actively gone to my hospital 3 weeks ago, impersonated my academic advisor, and tried to force the administration to drop me from the program so he could legally raid the account. When the dean refused to speak with him due to privacy laws, Dad simply went to the bank and lied under oath anyway. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed premeditated fraud. By the time I left the bank, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement. Ms. Vance had already flagged the $61,000 transfer as fraudulent, frozen the funds before they could clear into Julian's contractor escrow, and initiated a formal bank security investigation. Instead of going back to my quiet apartment, I drove straight to my parents' house. I knew where they'd be. Julian, Mom, and Dad always gathered in my parents' formal dining room after big family events to review Julian's finances and congratulate themselves on another victory. When I opened the front door and walked into the dining room, the room fell dead quiet. Dad was sitting at the head of the dark mahogany table with a spreadsheet laid out, a bottle of expensive whiskey between them. Julian looked up, a smug grin instantly creeping onto his face. "Look who decided to crawl back," Julian sneered, leaning back in his chair. "Come to beg Dad for allowance, Clara? Or are you here to apologize for making a scene in front of Mom? She's probably here because she finally realized she has no leg to stand on," Dad said coldly, not even bothering to look up from his papers. "The money is gone, Clara. It's already been allocated to your brother's property. If you want to throw a tantrum, do it somewhere else." I walked over to the table and stood directly across from my father. Slowly, deliberately, I unzipped my bag and laid 3 distinct documents down on top of his spreadsheets. First, my certified graduation certificate from the university, stamped with honors. Second, the bank's formal fraud investigation notice, naming Richard Sterling as the primary subject of a federal banking inquiry. And third, the official hospital security visitor log from July 14th. Dad's eyes dropped to the papers. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His smug posture collapsed, his fingers trembling slightly as he recognized the St. Jude Children's Hospital logo at the top of the security record. What is this?" Mom whispered, standing up from her seat, her eyes darting nervously between Dad and the legal notices. "That," I said, my voice as calm and unyielding as steel, "is proof that I graduated at the top of my class 2 weeks ago. And that security log is proof that 3 weeks ago, you went to my hospital, impersonated an official, and tried to sabotage my career so you could steal my inheritance." Julian frowned, looking at Dad. "Dad, what is she talking about? The transfer went through, right?" "The transfer was flagged," I said, looking right at Julian, "because Dad signed a sworn affidavit claiming I dropped out. He committed bank fraud, Julian. And because he tried to deposit those stolen funds directly into your house escrow, your new home's purchase is officially frozen." The air in the dining room turned suffocating. Julian's smug expression disintegrated instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He slammed his hands onto the table, pushing himself up so fast his chair screeched violently against the hardwood floor. "What do you mean frozen?" Julian roared, his voice cracking as he looked back and forth between our father and me. "I'm supposed to close on the title on Friday. I've already put down the non-refundable earnest money. Dad, tell me she's lying." My father couldn't answer. He sat frozen in his leather chair, staring blankly at the bank fraud notice with his mouth slightly open. For the first time in my 27 years, I saw Richard Sterling look completely small, exposed, and helpless. "She's not lying, Julian," I said, keeping my tone measured. The bank flagged the entire $61,000 pending a criminal review. Because Dad signed his name to a false affidavit, the funds were classified as proceeds of fraud. And since those funds were wired directly toward your house contract, your lender's legal department has officially placed a hold on your escrow account. No, 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 Julian stammered, pulling out his phone with shaking hands, frantically trying to dial his real estate broker. "You can't do this. That house is mine. I already held the housewarming party. Everyone knows I bought it." "You didn't buy anything, Julian," I corrected him softly. "Dad tried to steal my future to buy your pride. And now you're both going to pay for it." My mother sank back into her chair, covering her face as silent tears began to streak down her cheeks. The reality was finally sinking in. The grand facade they had built, the story of the golden, successful son and the useless, flaky daughter, was crumbling around them in real time. Within 48 hours, the news had leaked to the rest of our extended family. The very aunts, uncles, and cousins who had laughed at my expense during Julian's housewarming party were now calling my parents in disbelief. They discovered that the unreliable daughter was actually a board-certified nurse, and that my parents had tried to destroy my career to cover up Julian's endless financial reckless behavior. The golden child was exposed, and my father's reputation was ruined beyond repair. 2 weeks later, the bank's internal investigation officially concluded. The full $61,000 was restored to my account, along with interest penalties that my father was legally forced to pay directly out of his personal savings to avoid criminal prosecution. Without my education money to bail him out, Julian couldn't secure his loan. He was forced to back out of the 4-bedroom suburban home, forfeiting his earnest deposit and moving into a cramped, 1-bedroom basement apartment across town. As for me, I used my restored funds to clear my final licensing fees and secure a beautiful, sunlit studio apartment just 5 minutes from St. Jude Children's Hospital. Today, I work as a lead pediatric nurse in the very same unit where I logged those 800 secret hours. Every morning when I put on my scrubs and pin my badge to my chest, I look at the name stamped on it. Clara Sterling, RN. My parents tried calling me dozens of times, begging for forgiveness and asking if we could move past this as a family. I never answered. I finally realized that peace isn't about getting an apology from people who mistreated you. It's about building a life so solid that their noise can never reach you again. They spent years telling everyone I would never finish anything. But standing in my own apartment, looking out at the city skyline with my nursing degree framed on the wall, I realized they were wrong. I finished my education. I finished their control over my life. And I finished letting them steal my future. What would you have done if your family tried to steal your hard-earned future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.